On Friday, the 11th of November, Putin's forces confirmed they had withdrawn from Kherson city. It was the largest of 4 regions annexed in September and is considered Russia's most symbolic loss since the war started in February. Putin's defense minister Sergei Shoigu ordered his troops out of the city and across the Dnieper River to take up new defensive lines on the 9th of November. Numerous evidence has emerged that Russian equipment and weapons were left in the retreat and have now been claimed by Ukrainian forces. The retreat was clearly a military failure and an indication of Russia's struggle to hold on to stolen land from advancing Ukrainian troops. Now, 1 week after Putin's forces completed their withdrawal from Kherson, we spoke to former British Army officer Dr. Mike Martin about what went wrong for Russia's forces, why Putin's retreat was a military failure, and what Ukraine's next objectives are.
I'm Mike Martin. I'm a former army officer who spent a couple of years serving in Afghanistan. I'm now a senior fellow at the War Studies Department at King's College in London. I think we've all been pretty surprised at what's happened in Ukraine. When the conflict started, everyone thought Russia are going to win this. Obviously, they're one of the top 3-4 militaries in the world. But actually, Ukraine has significantly overperformed and the Russians have significantly underperformed. And so, apart from the initial stages of the war where Russia took quite a lot of territory really, really quickly, for the last 6 months or so, the Russians have only lost territory to the Ukrainians, or rather the Ukrainians have regained that territory off the Russians. And so your viewers probably remember around Kyiv, there was that big retreat in April. And then a couple of months ago, there was another big Ukrainian counteroffensive up in the northeast in a place called Kharkiv. And then most recently, over the last week or so, we've seen the Russians pull out from Kherson in the south. And overall, the Ukrainians have taken back about 75,000 square kilometers of territory. I think there are a number of reasons why Ukraine is winning and is, I think, going to eventually win this war. Their morale is much higher than the Russians. The Russians have got a conscript army. They're poorly equipped. Their morale is very poor. The Ukrainians are fighting to defend their homeland, and so for them it's existential. Also, logistics, stuff, bombs, bullets, fuel. The Russian logistics is pretty poor, and the Ukrainians have consistently attacked it and undermined it. So the Russian soldiers just don't have the supplies that they need. On the other hand, the Ukrainians have got really, really good logistics. They're fighting on their home turf. Their local villagers are helping them. So again, on those two important things, morale and logistics, Ukraine is doing much, much better than Russia. And then finally, a little bit about how the armies fight. So Russia is quite a top-down army, right? It's conscripts. They've been forced to be there. And so the orders start at the top and then they trickle down to the bottom and everyone has to do what they're told. Whereas the Ukrainians fight much more like a European or the American army, and they use something called mission command. And that's where you tell people what they need to achieve, but not how they do it. And so what it does is it makes the army much more flexible and much more able to respond to setbacks or to take advantage of opportunities. So the Ukrainians at a tactical level have managed to outfight the Russians because they can take decisions quicker, whereas the Russians are still asking up their chain of command how they should respond to this particular situation. So although Kherson kind of burst onto our screens and into our newspapers a couple of weeks ago, actually the Ukrainians have been preparing this since about June or July, where they've been slowly moving forward against the Russians in the south. And also, as we've discussed, they've been attacking the Russian supply lines in Kherson, so blowing up fuel dumps, ammunition dumps, attacking railway yards, taking out railway lines. So all that stuff that the Russian soldiers needed in Kherson to fight, they weren't getting. Your viewers might remember a couple of months ago, the Ukrainians dropped a really important bridge called the Kerch Bridge in between Crimea and Russia. And that was a kind of major supply line. And so when the Russians pulled out last week, what they said was, we're not pulling out because we're under direct military pressure from the Ukrainians, but actually we're pulling out because we can't supply our soldiers anymore, which, amounts to the same thing. But this Ukrainian strategy of constantly undermining and attacking the Russian supply lines paid off. And ultimately the Russians, 10 or 20,000 Russian soldiers were stuck on the wrong side of the river. They couldn't get supplies to them and they had to pull out. So Kherson was a really important city in military strategic terms. there's a big river that basically cuts Ukraine in half, called the Dnipro. It runs from Crimea in the south all the way up to Kyiv in the north. Kherson was the only foothold that the Russians had on the west bank of the Dnipro River, so on the other side of the Dnipro River from Russia. And so for them, it was a foothold that they could use for future operations, and it stopped Ukraine being able to put a defensive line along that river. So the fact that the Russians have had to withdraw from Kherson is a huge military defeat, as well as being a symbolic one, because it was one of the territories that they claimed as Russian, yet they've just had to withdraw from it. Obviously, Ukraine used to be part of the Soviet Union, so a lot of the military equipment that they use is very similar to the military equipment that the Russians use. So when the Russians are leaving behind equipment, the Ukrainians are able to take it over, integrate it into their forces, and most of them are trained on how to use the equipment. So it's particularly dangerous for Russia to leave behind equipment without destroying it. And the fact that that equipment wasn't destroyed, usually when you're retreating, if you can't withdraw with your equipment, you blow it up or damage it. The fact that that wasn't blown up or damaged or in any way disabled, I think speaks to how quickly the Russians left, how great the panic was, and how poorly planned their retreat was. A military withdrawal I think it's probably the most difficult military maneuver that you have to carry out. The reason that is because you need to thin out all of your supplies and logistics behind your front line, because you don't want the enemy to capture them, but your troops also need to have supplies whilst they're fighting this withdrawal or fighting a retreat. And the other thing you should do is to try and conduct your withdrawal in secret and then announce it afterwards to the world. And the Russians didn't necessarily manage to achieve all of that. And it would be very difficult for a well-trained army, but let alone the Russian army, which is not very well-trained. So they did, in the end, leave quite a lot of supplies behind, which the Ukrainians are now taking advantage of. And that's equipment, but also fuel and ammunition. They did indeed leave a couple of thousand soldiers on the wrong side as well. And many of those had to change into civilian clothing and try and escape. And then, of course, the big mistake they made was to announce that they were withdrawing before they'd completed their withdrawal. So they probably took a few more losses than they needed to have because of that big announcement that they made that they were actually withdrawing. So as the Russians retreated, and this is pretty normal stuff, they left a bunch of booby traps and mines, and they left explosives under bridges and culverts and all that stuff. And that's pretty normal tactics, because what it does is it slows down the advancing force. So you can leave the booby traps out and then retreat, and then the Ukrainians, in this case, as they're coming forward, have to deal with those before they can close with and engage the Russian forces. So yeah, there's lots of reports of Russian surprises left behind for the Ukrainians. But I think most of those now, what are we, a week on? I think most of those now are being dealt with, have been dealt with. Before the Russians withdrew from Kherson city, they built these defensive lines on the other side of the river, on the side of the river nearest Russia. And they actually built 3 parallel lines of defenses. So these are pretty sophisticated and well fortified defensive lines. The thing about defensive lines is you can't move them, right? So if you're trying to attack them, you don't want to go through them, you want to go around them. And although information security is very tight, we've actually seen some inklings on various social media channels over the last couple of days that it looks like Ukraine has done an amphibious landing in a place called Kinburn Split, and also is looking at doing a left flanking maneuver from their perspective so that it can come around both sides of these fortifications. Because of course, once you've got around the fortifications, then you're amongst the Russian forces and you're attacking their flanks. So I think we need to watch this space, but it certainly seems like the initial stages of that are being done at the moment. So I think now the thing to watch over winter is that Ukraine is going to continue fighting. That's quite clear. They're better equipped for winter. They've got better morale than the Russians, so they will continue fighting because they will be at an advantage over the Russians. It's also clear that their goal is Crimea. taking of Crimea in 2014 by the Russians is totally tied up with Putin personally and politically. And so it's the strategic center of gravity for the Ukrainians. It's unlikely that they're going to launch a direct military assault, but if we look at how the Ukrainians have operated so far, there's only 3 ways into Crimea. They'll cut the supply lines into Crimea, and then they'll start bleeding the Russian military of the supplies that it needs to operate effectively in Crimea. So that's the stage that I see developing over the winter. And then, of course, in the spring, we'll see a more fluid offensive start up. I expect the war to be over by next summer and in Ukraine's favor.